was a soggy September day in 1973 when I boarded a plane with my parents bound for the US. As a well-mannered 4-year-old, I spent 12 hours on a plane running up and down the aisle, pestering everybody. When are we going to be there? When are we going to be there? And telling them all that we were on our way to Racine, Wisconsin, where my grandmother awaited, whose name I carried. No sooner several years into our journey, I quickly became the classic latchkey American kid. And my escape really was my bike, and it was my best friend. And it allowed me to escape the taunting and the teasing for being too foreign, too fat, too this, too that. And life was pretty lonely as an only child. And then 5:30 would roll in, and I'd run into the house, and we'd get around our little TV, and we'd watch World News Tonight. It was our secret portal to my homeland. It was like an umbilical cord. And soon my heroes became Barbara Walters, Frank Reynolds, and many, many others. So it should become as no surprise that I wrote to Walter Cronkite for Career Day in kindergarten. Now you might be surprised he did write back. There it was in black and white, all my 20 questions answered. 16 years of education, he said it would take. Undeterred, 16 years later, I graduated from Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. But I graduated the year that my homeland imploded. See, I'm from what was once Yugoslavia. And as a kid, I spent a lot of time abroad. And this crisis imploded around everyone I loved, aunts, uncles, cousins. And now, at best, they were sitting ducks. At worst, they were trapped, and I with them, glued to the TV in what was now the emergence of the 24-hour cable news cycle. So when I got the call from U.S. Congresswoman from Maryland, Helen Bailey Bentley, at 3 a.m., God love her, to see whether I would be willing to be one of 10 young journalists to go and work for the newly named Prime Minister of Yugoslavia, one of her personal friends, I said, I'm all in. I heard Prime Minister, and I'm like, I got this. After all, we moved to Missouri when I was 11, where I became the go-to babysitter for the governor's family. Like, how different could it be? And after all, I wasn't the only one going. There were 9 others that were going with us. My 22-year-old brain was ready. Team of 10 turned to be just me, the only one brave enough to get on the plane. And I will never forget that first day. Little me standing in front of a big elevator. Out of the elevator comes former U.S. Secretary of State, Special Envoy Cyrus Vance, and 5 other characters straight out of the evening news. I thought I was going to pass out. Along with them came out the Prime Minister, a U.S. businessman attempting to run a government like he runs his companies. Sound familiar? There's a big difference. He wasn't allowed to pick his cabinet. He wasn't allowed to pick his security detail. They were on rent to him. And I will never forget hearing, and I still hear the sound of his voice as he's coaxing his cabinet to open their mouths. They're sitting there in silence. And he's like, people are dying and you're playing these political games. And the madder he got, the more English came out of his mouth. If you didn't understand both languages, you were lost. He was truly a remarkable, incredible human being with an incredible work ethic. And his team soon took me in and really became my anchors. And boy, did I need an anchor. We were bugged, we were tapped, we were followed, we were threatened every day. The only real conversations to be had happened right out of a movie in street corners or intersections. And just when I thought things couldn't possibly get crazier, I wake up one morning to a headline. American woman banned from government building pending investigation. Who could that be? Was my first thought. My second thought, and I'll never forget the day because at 22 it was the first time I associated the adjective woman with me. And then I had this horrifying thought. What if my mom finds out? In the middle of all this, certainly the fighting continued to spread and there were journalists everywhere. But no amount of preparation really prepared me for seeing my heroes from the press corps sitting at the press club bar night after night, sending college kids to the front lines, writing stories out of context because they weren't there. Or photojournalists who were leaving the region because they couldn't sell a picture of the wrong victim. If I had a penny for every time CNN showed you one city while they were talking about another, you didn't know the difference, but I did. And that kid who wrote to Cronkite in kindergarten really needed them to care about the facts, because I had family caught in the crosshairs. They didn't. From the moment that we were forced to go back home, back to the US, threatened with house arrest, for probably the next 5 to 10 years, I grappled with a deep sense of disillusionment. After all, I was going through the mother of all identity crisis. I questioned my citizenship, I questioned my politics, I questioned my profession, I questioned my DNA. And that disillusionment soon led to a real sense of anger. I became Lieutenant Dan from Forrest Gump when he scales up the sail and he's railing against God in the middle of a hurricane. I was mad. In the middle of my storm, I come across an article that was so dangerous and had so many implications. It's a document. And of course I was going to leak it to the press. That was like, no question. But when I did, the price was high. They were like, you want to see this run? Bury your head in the sand. It ran in the Washington Post the same day I landed in Phoenix, where I had some family, few friends, no history, and a whole lot of sand. Sand to pound my head in, asking questions. Why me? What's the point? What's next? And in the middle of a pity party, I get a phone call from the Prime Minister asking if I'd be willing to go and monitor the first Bosnian election. Like a moth to a flame, there I went. Entering Sarajevo 10 days after the last peace accord. I don't want to underscore how dangerous the situation was. Standing on the bridge, walking into the city, I had a guy tap me on the shoulder. "Are you part of the prisoner exchange?" he said. But I cannot explain the dam that broke within me when I asked one of the locals to take me to see Sniper Alley, which was probably the equivalent of a couple of table rows, no further back than the back of the room. And I really wanted to know why people were crossing. When he said people were crossing because the city officials would turn off the water on a slow news day, something in me broke. I found the first open church, and I wept, and I cried. I cried for my country, I cried for its children, I cried for my dream, I cried for theirs. And I prayed, God, give me the strength to understand that which I cannot change. And I closed a chapter of 20 years of my life. I will never forget its lessons. We're all fragile. Peace is fragile. Being part of something bigger than yourself, nothing is more rewarding. In that moment of being able to walk away, I was able to pivot from wanting to affect the situation to wanting to understand it. And in that search for understanding, I discovered one thing. All the front lines across the Balkans, and God knows across many conflicts, have one astonishing thing in common. They can mile mark the lowest levels of education. And the more I threw myself into education, the more I found hope and a way to start rebuilding who I wanted to define myself as. Now, I will forever be grateful to the Prime Minister and his team because they did one remarkable thing for me. They validated that I was smart, that I was capable, and that I was valued. And I call forth that validation to this day. But knowing the gift that they gave me, I have not forgotten that, and I pass that on. And I've built a reputation to the chagrin of many of my colleagues. I take in strays. I put at the table people would otherwise look past. And I leave you with one story from my days at Apollo. In the middle of this, what I'd call, financial flurry, and we had all of these experts, consultants, high paid with high pedigrees, 6 months working on a project. And in I walk into the meeting with my leads analyst, Angie. Never in the history of man was less expected of two people. As they proceeded to high-five each other of 6 months' great work, there you see Angie rustling papers. She suddenly looks up and says, "Gentlemen, where's the rent?" Out of the mouth of babes. Never underestimate the contribution that one person who's allowed to critically think for themselves can make to the world. And there are three that will never grow old. Arizona sunsets, being told that no one ever believed in me until I met you, and walking into a room when they expect this and giving them more.